it almost appears as though there's never a dull moment where politics are concerned, where electioneering is concerned, coming up with the various political parties saying we need to put a halt to this process. In fact, mentioning a very intricate point which says, how is it that we can continue counting the votes if we understand that there's been so much of a compromise to even the process? I'm obviously speaking about the issue of individuals voting more than once, about 20 arrested, but should that not have merited an actual halt so that indeed it can be verified whether or not these elections are fair and fair? What are your opinions regarding that? Look, I'm going to start off with you.
Well, I mean, it's all about the materiality of the problem. So that is the extent to which we have seen the manifestation of people double voting. We do know that by far and large, a number of people are saying, look, I still have my thumb marker. There have been instances where I've been talking to a number of people even here at The Rock that say it does appear in some voting stations that the people doing the marking might not be pressing hard enough, they might be making a small dot and all of that. That's partly a training question which was raised in a press briefing last night as the extent of training. Of course, we are training over 160,000 people, but that is no excuse because you should be able to train all of them to levels of efficiency that are necessary to safeguard the process of the elections. I do find it, though, given the fact that these parties sit in the party liaison committee as well, they should be awaiting the audit, and I think the DA is taking a much more circumspect approach to this, to say let the audit be done, let's see how material these issues are. My biggest problem is how the extent to which we trust the auditing process. What is the methodology being employed? What are you going to be reconciling? What is your triangulation? I mean, you've got the VEC forms, so Section 24A forms. If a person filled them more than once, you will know that there's probably an instance of double voting. How do you sample your VDs against your wards, against your municipalities, to ensure that a person wouldn't have hopped outside an area of their VD? So which scanners do you actually take to reconcile and all of that? So a methodological process, how the IEC will explain its auditing methodology, will be very interesting to check whether or not that methodology is intact enough to give us a result that we respect. I don't think the issue of double voting is as widespread, unless there was someone who systematically planned it, is as widespread as it is alluded to. However, of course, to safeguard the credibility and the integrity of the elections, the IEC ought to give responses that are comprehensive and satisfactory to everybody. But I do think the smaller, and of course they say there are no smaller parties here. They are smaller by virtue of what we see on the board. Yeah. And I do think it might be that there's a bit of letting off some steam out of disappointment with the numbers that are coming up, and all sort of necessary stalling processes to the process would be done. I don't think we should halt the process of counting and tallying unless we understand the extent to which the problem is. And as I'm suggesting, of course, not only are the numbers on the line, money is on the line. You know, if those deposits don't come back if you don't get a seat in the legislature or the National Assembly. So quite a lot is on the line for the parties that are not posting beyond 5,000 votes at this stage, when we've counted almost 60% of the voting districts.
Caesar, I want to bring you into this. I mean, we're speaking about the Democratic Alliance, which is saying that perhaps it's got a more logical approach to ensure that the actual auditing process takes place. But it's also the Democratic Alliance, I think, that lodged about 2,000 objections so far within the process in itself. So it says something about, though it's the waiting game, but it appears as though there's also a level of disgruntlement, 2,000 of alike, in terms of the actual electoral process in itself. And what does that say, really, about the nature in which the IEC has been unfolding its processes, and also the way in which this particular election has been handled?
I think there's a certain need for circumspection in this time. It's a time when things are moving very fast, and there's almost a need to jump to knee-jerk conclusions. But in my view, we need to separate two issues. I think this election has been delivered credibly. I agree with Lukona that this would have to be an unprecedented conspiracy for double voting to really have fundamentally affected the results. But allied to that is the question of how these allegations of wrongdoing have been responded to and communicated. And so even though I think these are a relatively small number of complaints, when you look at 22,000 voting stations and 26 million voters, it's incumbent on the IEC to communicate the way it's dealing with these in an unambiguous way. And so I feel that what we have is a credible election that isn't being communicated credibly, and that's causing some uncertainty both among political parties and the electorate. I think we need to sit back and realize this vote expresses the will of the South African people to a very high degree of confidence. But the IEC is struggling, in my view, to communicate the way that it seeks to address these problems in a way that gives comfort to all in our democracy. And that's quite an important problem, because the credibility of an election is not just the outcome, but it's the way the outcome is communicated.
And that's exactly what we were battling with last night. Look what I'm going to... That's what we're saying, that the IEC is not putting its best foot forward when it comes to explaining, because this issue goes to the very credibility of this election. In other words, as much as you may well be perhaps confident of your facts and your processes, but if you do not give the electorate and those who are observing the confidence, that you need to give it to them, then you are going to be found wanting.
No, certainly the communications management of the IEC, I think, to some levels has been quite appalling around these issues. One, they've adopted a strategy to first downplay an issue without the facts, and they come with generalities. So they'll tell us about how far we've come, 25 years as a democracy, we've been running elections. But that's not in dispute. We know exactly how far we've come as a country. That's why we are celebrating 25 years of democracy. What is important is to respond to the facts and the issues that are put before them. If they do not know, don't come to the media with half-baked facts. That's what has been happening. So downplay, and then when they actually see that something is gaining traction. So when this double voting thing, and whether the ink is indelible or not, there was one or two parties that were making the pronouncement. Then they realized that parties are holding press briefings, and then they realized, no, in fact they are starting to hear now outside of the rock that people have been double voting, and then now they see it as serious. Only today the decision to audit is actually taken, and not necessarily yesterday. And part of the problem there, Vuyo, is to say, if your comms management is poor, as Caesar is saying, the perception around a very small problem will be ballooned out of proportion. And that is of your own doing, and that's why you need to be intact. And I think,
and obviously, those who stand to lose, looking at the numbers,
take advantage of the process.
Will take advantage.
Absolutely, and I actually think this is almost allegorical for the way these elections have played out, because in my view, the smaller parties have not succeeded in gaining representation in this election. But what they have done cumulatively is actually lowered the votes of all in this election. And in the same way now, I think there's an attempt to spoil the credibility of this election by the parties who haven't gained representation. But together, they can actually change the outcomes of the way this election is perceived. And so I think partly this protest is a representation of what we've seen with the results that have come through today.
6 democratic elections, and it goes back to the question of, did we not know that the 8th of May was coming? Did we not have our I's dotted and our T's crossed to ensure that such issues of around a communication strategy, one would expect that a communication strategy is at the base point in terms of any form of a strategic planning, especially for an operation of this magnitude, which is over a specific period of time. But to even know that press conferences and briefings were actually cancelled and halted even yesterday by the very same IEC and opted rather to release a statement says something about either is it the lack of preparedness, or B, that we did not know that the 8th of May was actually coming, or C, somebody else is pulling the strings somewhere. Now, this might be conspiracy, but on the other side of it, but given the fact that it's the 6th time we're doing this, and it appears as though it almost feels as though it's the first time we're doing this, questions need to be raised.
Well, Faith, there is a first-time player in these elections. Those are the smart IDs at a national provincial election. So the problem there is that the IEC didn't put a mechanism in place besides the mark on the thumb to safeguard that you have voted or not. Remember, with the green ID, there would be a stamp that goes on the green ID. Now, one would say some people had 2 IDs, but they're very marginal. The point is, at the point of occurrence, when you enter a voting station, before you are issued with a ballot, can the system tell that you have voted or not? The answer is that it can't. Now, the IEC will not stand on the podium and say our system as it stands was incapable yesterday to tell when you enter the voting station for the second time elsewhere that you've actually voted. Now, that was the weakness. Those were the T's that were not crossed and the I's that were not dotted at a system design place. The IEC quickly jumps to, if you try and double vote, it's prosecutable. We know that. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in answers on the system. And what the IEC is failing and unable or unwilling to do is admit that there was a system failure where they couldn't cater technologically for the smart ID in the same way where for the green ID, they would stamp the green ID book to show that you have actually voted. So there was no stamping of the smart ID even at a virtual level. And of course, you'll remember, there was a point in time the IEC called all political parties, said, bring your IT specialists, we want to introduce a new technology. It will be interesting to see how far that attempt went and what necessarily was achieved out of it, because there is a system problem, as we've been saying since yesterday. There is a system problem. The IEC won't admit to it. The problem, though, is if you take the system to court, will the courts say, because the system did not have enough safeguards, and you may not be able to understand the extent to which the malice or mischief has been conducted on the system, therefore you can't pass this as free and fair and credible elections? That is the key question at the design. Can the design be passed as having been incapable of delivering free and fair and credible elections, even if there was no mischief, just the system itself? That's the big question.
And that is where we're going to leave this particular issue. Our rolling coverage from the National Results Center, of course, continues. And here's what we're going to be doing next. We're going to rest our panel of analysts for a short while, and we're going to go around the country to get updates from our correspondents throughout the country to bring us to date with what they are seeing, what they are hearing from their respective vantage points. And thereafter, we will, of course, be looking at what you are seeing right behind us. It is the numbers as they stand, what they could mean, and we're going to bring our analysts back to look at those numbers and what they may mean going forward.